Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Here's an old advertisement for using a flashlight using flash powder. Joshua Lionel Cohen, an inventor best known for his Lionel model railroads and toy trains, worked alongside photographer Paul Boyer, and they introduced the flash lamp right before the turn of the 20th century. Now, flash powder had existed before this as well, but the design had a trough that would hold the flash powder and then be ignited via electricity from a dry cell battery. So quite a bit of work involved in setting off one of these flashes if you wanted to take a photograph. So really they were only used by professional photographers. But really around that time, just before the turn of the century, anybody who was taking photographs typically was somebody who was working as a professional. It was before mass photography began, with the invention of the box brownie and Kodak in 20th century. But the next time you take a photograph and the flash goes off on your phone and on your camera, just think about how much work you would have had to done in the past for that to happen. So we really have a jam-packed lesson for you all about flash photography. So let's get right on into it. You're here with myself, William Eames, of course, as usual. And glad to see you here again. Keep attending those lessons really is the key to success and improving your photography. Let's not forget about Morpheus as well. If you have any questions at all, you can simply chat to Morpheus. Type in any questions that you have. And please do remember to rate the responses. We improve the responses based on your ratings. So don't be afraid to be quite severe and harsh with those ratings so we can better your experience. So as I mentioned, we are on to flash photography, and we're going to be looking at this over the next 4 lessons. Really, we're going to be having a look at, I suppose, our more traditional flashes in this lesson and in the next lesson. And we'll be moving into studio photography then for lessons 7 and 8. But a lot of what we learn in these lessons will be applied to your studio photography and to flash work in general. If you've never used a flash before, I mean, you're really missing out on a huge part of potential, creative potential with your photography, but also just a way to overcome issues that you may be having with your day-to-day photography exposure issues. And really understanding flash and how flash works is going to be essential if you really want to get into this in a professional capacity. There's just going to be situations where you have to use a flash, particularly things like weddings. And I know there's a lot of you out there that would be saying, I like working with natural light, and that's perfectly fine. You still need to know how to use a flash. And in fact, understanding how to use a flash and how flash works will improve your understanding of lighting overall, including natural light, and you'll be able to utilize and read natural light much better when you understand how to use artificial lighting as well. So in this lesson, we're going to get familiar with the basics of flash. We're going to have a look at, first of all, different types of flashes that are available to us. We'll have a look at how flash works, how to control flash exposure, and then in the next lesson, we'll look at how we can get really creative with using flash so that you can really enjoy it. So let's kick things off by having a look at different types of flashes that are available to us, their advantages and their disadvantages. And the first one that's going to be most familiar to us is going to be our built-in flashes. So our built-in flash, this is something we're going to have on our compact cameras, on our smartphones. Some SLRs will have them. Not all SLRs have them. It depends on the camera that you're using. But typically, we should be quite familiar with these ones there. The pop-up flashes that pop up usually when we're photographing in automatic mode, it'll pop up and it's there to just add a little bit of extra light. So the characteristics of these pop-up flashes is that, as I mentioned, they're available on most cameras, on smartphones, on compact cameras and so on. And they're there just to give more light, simply just to add more light when it's needed. And they often fire in automatic modes because, as we've seen so many times throughout this course, when we're photographing in automatic mode, all the camera wants to do is get a correct exposure. And very often it's going to go to the flash to do that, to fulfill that purpose, to add that extra bit of light. We have a fixed direction here. So direction is going to play a huge part when it comes to flash and to lighting. So we'll be speaking about that a lot. But we have fixed direction. It's just above the lens and it is straight forward. So we really can't do much beyond that. It's just simply straight towards whatever subject we're pointing at. The light spread is limited because the actual area here is quite small. And again, this is going to be something we'll be speaking about a lot. The light that is being projected from this area, it's very small, so we don't get a huge spread of light from it. Now we can change that by adding modifiers. So there are a certain range of modifiers, flash modifiers, available for pop-up flashes. They are quite limited, but they do help to soften the light or to spread it out a little bit more. And again, we're really going to be digging into modifiers throughout these next 4 lessons. The power output, very much automatic, very much determined by the camera settings. So whatever camera settings you happen to be using is going to determine the flash power output. We have limited control over this pop-up flash. That's not to say that we can't use it, that it's not completely useless or anything like that, but it is very, very limited. And as I mentioned, its first purpose really is just to add more light to a scene. But it can be balanced with ambient light. So typically, this is the type of photograph that we would use, or that we would get when using a pop-up flash. So it's actually used quite well because we have a balance with the ambient light here in the background. That's the natural light available, but there are some issues here. It does create quite a lot of shadow. There's some hot spots here as well, as we can see here on the skin tone too. So this is probably quite a familiar looking photograph to you when we use a pop-up flash. Great for nights out, great for parties and events and things where we don't really want to think too much about our exposures. We just want to capture the photograph. That's typically when we're going to be using a pop-up flash. Moving on then, the next one should be one that's much more familiar to you, and this is of course our external flash units. So these are the types of ones that will attach to the top of our camera. So these guys, sometimes they're known as speed lights. Really, speed lights is what we refer to them if you're using Canon, but it has become almost like a colloquial term. The biggest advantage with these types of flashes is that we have much more power and control. So there's a much greater power output from them. The flash travels further. There's quicker recycling time, meaning that you can take another flash photograph a lot faster than if you're just using, say, a pop-up flash. We can just do far more in terms of the power output. Another huge advantage with them is the flexible movable head allows for directional lighting, so we can bounce the light off different objects. We can point it towards the ceiling, we can bounce it off walls to the side. This helps to diffuse the light because whatever surface you're pointing that at becomes the new light source. So it almost acts like a modifier, something we're going to be digging a lot deeper into as we go on throughout this lesson. But it's a massive advantage to be able to have that option. As I mentioned, larger flash area means that we've got a greater spread of light due to a larger flash head. This helps to give, kind of a diffusion type of effect as well, kind of a softer light coming out of it because we have a greater area that we can control. It operates as a TTL and manual. So TTL we'll speak about later on in the lesson. That's through the lens. Basically, it's automatic. To kind of simplify it, it means automatic control, and we also have manual control. On the majority of these units will offer a manual control as well. They're not universal, so you need to get the correct amount for each camera type. So just like our camera lenses, you need to make sure that you get the correct mount. Now there are, of course, third-party and aftermarket brands available as well. You don't have to stick with the branded flashes either, but you can't use, say, a Canon flash on a Nikon camera and so on. But they can be expensive. So you can be going much higher in price for these types of flashes. But I see them as an investment because really, if you get a good one, they will last you a very, very long time. Moving on from that, we can get a number of accessories for our external flash units as well. The first one here being a flash sync cable. So this allows us to go off camera with our flash unit. So it means that we can change the direction of where the light is coming from. So it allows movement of the flash away from the top of the camera, so it's not just at a fixed position. All settings and everything will still function as normal, as if it is attached to the camera. Different lighting directions can be achieved. This really is a game changer. It just offers you so many more options, more possibilities and approaches when you're doing portrait photography, food photography, whatever type of photography you happen to be using it for. The sync cables themselves are relatively inexpensive. You should be able to pick them up. You can go as low as €10 depending on the type of one you go for. Branded ones, again, are going to cost a little bit more, but they are limited by the cable length. So these kind of sync cables are much better for situations where you're in a controlled environment. So for example, if you're using your flash unit in a studio environment, sync cable is a good option because you're likely not going to be moving around too much. Again, if you're photographing, say, food photography, and you're using a flash, it's a good idea to have one of these just to give you a couple of more options. They're also useful for wedding photography too, just giving you a little bit more room to play around with your kind of different lighting styles. Wireless versions are available as well, so if you want to be untethered and you want more room to move around, we can go with wireless versions. And these operate in a couple of different ways, using either radio or infrared signals. Radio has a much farther range. It's also better in the sense that it doesn't need to see the other device. Infrared can be a little bit trickier to use because it actually has to see the device that it's connecting to. So radio transmitters are much better. You can certainly get ones that will go much farther than 100 meters in range. Again, your flash settings are unaffected, and because you are not limited by a cable, you've got huge possibilities for the direction of light. It is possible also to sync multiple flashes together. So if you're trying to do multi-light setups, you'd certainly want to be using a trigger like this, and you can sync those flashes together then. But they are expensive, so you're going to be paying more for these then compared to the sync cables. But really the advantages here are numerous, far more than going with the sync cable. And many of these will actually also act as wireless cable releases as well. They double in that function, so even if you're not using them just to fire off-camera flash, they can be used as triggers in themselves. So they're great for low light and for nighttime photography as well. And taking the flash off camera can lead you to set up photographs like this here. Here we can see that the couple is being lit from the photographer's right hand side, kind of at an angle here as well, because you can see the direction of light, the way it's falling on them. So it offers a huge amount of possibilities, and certainly with wedding photography and kind of the posed types of photographs, off camera flash is very, very popular, and you can get some tremendous results when used correctly. Moving on then, a flash that we're a little bit more familiar with are macro flash. We talked about these back in our macro lesson, used for close-up and macro photography. They're great for product and food photography as well. They're not limited to this though. Of course you can use them for other purposes. Lots of variations available, different brackets for different needs. Again, we looked at this back in our macro flash lesson, so I'm not going to go too in-depth into this. But you can get different brackets depending on the type of macro photography that you're doing. They are amongst the most expensive flash setups out there. You can be paying up to €700 for a good macro flash setup. But of course you get tremendous results with them, like this photograph here. Now we can see here very much the lighting just on the top of this particular insect there. So you can see there where the flash has been applied. A little bit out of focus, so some focusing issues here, but when you're that close to shot, the depth of field is absolutely incredibly narrow. Any kind of little bit of movement is going to lose focus there, but it's still a stunning shot. I really love this detail here, but that's highlighted there with the use of that macro flash. Finally then, in our flash types, we have a ring flash. Ring flashes are a very distinctive type of flash. They can be used like a macro flash. Very often they're used for macro photography as well. They're also very popular in fashion and in portraiture and in beauty photography too, because it's a very distinctive look of them. Very limited in direction capability as they are attached to the front of the lens, so they're really just going to be pointing straight forward wherever you're pointing the lens at. They are also very expensive. So there is a big price range with these. It is possible to buy more, I suppose, better value versions of them, but they're not going to have the same power output as the Pro versions. But Pro versions are top of the line. They're the most expensive type of flashes out there, but you get great results from them. But it's hard to recommend investing in them unless you're working as a professional portrait photographer. As I mentioned, they also have a very distinctive look to them as well. And it's this kind of high fashion type of look, very often used in high fashion photography. You can see here we have a little bit of vignetting around the edges. I think there was an advert there with Keira Knightley not so long ago for I think it was Dior perfume, where there was an advert with a photographer in it, and he was photographing her using a ring flash. And again, as I said, there's a very distinctive look of them. So they're very, very popular for this type of photography. And actually, they're used for street photography as well. Very often, contemporary street photographers will use a ring flash to add a little bit of light to their subjects when they're moving very, very fast. So that's a very brief overview of the different types of flashes that are available to us. Really, when we speak about how flash works and we continue on through these lessons, we're very much going to be having a look at our external flash units. Because they offer us the most control, they're the most affordable in, I suppose, at this level, and the majority of photographers would be using them as well. And really, if you're thinking about investing in a flash, you should be looking at an external flash unit first of all, unless you're very much interested in getting into, say, macro photography or portrait photography. You might consider macro or ring flashes. But for the majority of us, I really think that having a look at external flash units and understanding how they work is the best place to start. So when it comes to how flash works, well, basically there's two main ways. There is what's known as our TTL. This is through the lens, our automatic system, and there is manual flash as well. So we can use flash manually. The majority of the time, we're going to be using TTL. We're going to be using the through the lens system. We can still affect exposure using TTL. We still have a lot of control when using TTL. Manual flash obviously gives us complete control over our subject, over the power output of our flash, but it is much trickier to use. And really, manual flash is much better in situations where we're in more controlled environments, like in a studio environment. And certainly when we get to studio photography, we will be using manual flash. But we're going to have a look, we'll have a look at both of them in this lesson, but really we'll have a focus on how to get the most out of our TTL systems. So how does TTL work? So, well, just to define it, so TTL is essentially auto mode for flashes, and TTL is through the lens. So how it works is that it sends out a pre-flash that bounces off your subject, and this comes back through the lens, and it gives our camera lots of information, particularly distance, the focal length that you're using, and it also takes into account the exposure settings that you have dialed into the camera. And based on all of this information, it determines the correct amount of light to use. It does this in a split second. So if you're ever using a flash, try to look out for this, because sometimes you can see it, but it happens so fast that this pre-flash comes out and comes back with all of this information before the photograph is actually taken. Just a quick note on TTL. TTL is camera brand specific. So in other words, a Canon flash isn't going to use or work with a Fuji. Sony's not going to work with Nikon, but there are aftermarket or third-party brands available. Now, there are also advanced TTL systems. Certainly, if you're using a Canon flash, you're going to see it says ETTL. That's his evaluative through the lens system. Nikon has ITTL, I forget what the I stands for, Pentax is PTTL, and so on. They all have their own advanced versions of these TTL systems with, I suppose, this incentive that you stick with their brand to get the most out of the flash. And I would recommend that if you can afford it, to try and stick with the brand flashes, because there is a better communication between them. However, if you can't afford them, going with a third party brand like Yongnuo, like Sigma, they do their own range of flashes. They're perfectly fine as well. You're not going to lack really anything, once you know how to use the flash correctly by going with these types of systems. So how does TTL work? So as I mentioned, we have this pre-flash system. So we have our camera, we have our flash, we have our subject, and when we press the shutter button to take our photograph, as I said, in an instant, a pre-flash is sent out. The pre-flash measures the subject's distance. It also takes into account your current camera settings, so your focal length, your aperture, and your ISO setting. Now, there's one setting there that it doesn't take into account, and that's shutter speed. And I'll speak about why that is a little bit later on. But it sends the flash out, or the pre-flash out. That information then comes back in through the lens. It's interpreted by the camera's system, by the flash system as well, and it will then finally fire the flash. So all of that happens in an instant. It's really incredible technology, truth be told. When you break it down like this, like just how rapidly it happens. So typically this will give you a very good exposure based on all of that information. But a thing to remember with TTL, just like any automatic system, similarly to the automatic modes in our cameras, it wants to try and keep everything middle grey. So with this, it's always just trying to get the correct exposure. So you may run into issues if you're trying to underexpose, or you're trying to photograph a very dark subject and keep those tones very dark. Or if you're photographing a very bright subject, a very white subject, you want to try and keep those tones very white. You may find that the TTL gets it wrong for you. And we can control that using flash exposure compensation. We'll speak about that in a few moments. If you move away from your subject, so for example, say the distance between your subject is greater than the previous image, so if they're standing very far away, or perhaps you happen to be using a telephoto lens or a higher focal length, your flash will actually zoom as well. So sometimes when you are zooming in and out, so if you happen to be using a variable zoom lens and you have your flash attached, you may hear a motor in your flash. That's actually the flash zooming in and out along with your lens. So as that distance is increased, the flash will zoom with the lens, but the spread of light is going to be narrower. So because you're zooming in with your lens, that flash is also zooming in as well. That spread of light is going to be more concentrated. This may lead to a more contrasty type of photograph because you have a narrower spread of light. But do be aware that you can use your flash with zoom lenses as well, or with telephoto lenses, that your flash will adjust for these focal lengths too. Moving on to our manual flash. So most TTL flashes will offer a manual mode. It's pretty standard. It's indicated as M, unsurprisingly, on your flashes. You can also get older ones that are purely manual only. Now, if you happen to have old film cameras and old flash units, it's not really recommended that you use them with your digital cameras, as the voltage could be different and this can cause issues, so it's not recommended. Now, I'm talking about ones that are decades old. If you have one that was made for more recent film cameras, so for example ones that might have been made within the last 10 years, last 15 years, these should be perfectly fine Always check online to be sure. You can guarantee somebody else has used them before with a digital camera, so definitely check it out. But if you happen to find one from the 80s or from the 70s, really not recommended to use those with your digital camera, as it can fry the circuitry due to voltage issues. But when it comes to controlling manual flash, so there's basically 4 steps that we can take. But the first thing is you're going to have to do some test shots. It's very unlikely that you're going to get it right on the first time. So with manual flash, it just takes more time, and for this reason, it's not ideal for situations where you're under a lot of pressure. Like if you're photographing a wedding, there's a lot of movement. Manual flash is going to be very, very difficult to use in that situation. But we have 4 factors that control the power output of manual flash. First one is our aperture. So increasing or decreasing the aperture size is going to affect the flash brightness. If we close down the aperture, the flash brightness is going to become less. If we open up the aperture, the flash brightness is going to become more. Our ISO will also have an effect. So increasing, decreasing ISO will have an effect on the brightness of the flash too. Typically, you're going to keep these 2 settings fairly constant though. I'd only ever change these 2 settings if I'm really struggling to get the correct brightness out of the flash. Usually though, you're going to leave these 2 settings alone. We can alter the power output manually. Really, this is going to be the one that you'll be doing the most, is simply just dial up or dial down that power output on the actual flash unit itself. There'll be a plus and minus just to increase or decrease the actual power output. This is going to be the quickest way to change the flash brightness. But we can also change the distance, and this is a big one. Changing distance will change the power of the light, or it'll change the amount of light that falls onto your subject. It doesn't really change the power output, but it will have a big impact on the actual fall of light onto your subject. And for this reason, this is why manual flash isn't really good for high pressure environments, high stress photo shoots like weddings, like event photography, because your distance is going to change a lot. If you're in a studio environment, or if you're in a macro setup or something like that, you may have much more consistent distances, so you can rely on your settings a little bit more. And for those reasons, manual flash is very, very good to use in those situations, especially in a studio. But when it comes to these high pressure environments, using TTL is recommended. So this fall off in light is known as the inverse square law. Sounds complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward. So the inverse square law. So say we have our subject quite close to the camera, but we have a second subject that's much further away from the camera. When we fire off our flash, the subject that is closer to the camera and closer to the flash is going to have much more light. There's a huge amount of light that falls off as the distance increases. If our first subject is standing about 1 meter away from the camera and we're photographing them at f16, the second subject is standing 10 meters away, they will receive 16 times less light. 16 times less light. So to get the correct exposure for that second subject, we would have to open up the aperture to f4. Remember, because that's letting in 16 times more light. It's doubling the light each time. So that's 4 stops, which means that we have 16 times light difference. So this is something to be aware of. Basically, to simplify it, if your subject is very far away from you, you're going to have to either open up that aperture, you're going to have to increase the ISO, you're going to have to increase the power output of the flash, or if possible, simply try to get closer. So do be aware of this. In the inverse square law, this applies not just to flash photography, but it applies to any kind of lighting setup that you might be using. So even if you're using, say, constant light sources, so if you're in a studio and you happen to be using continuous light sources, constant light sources, this inverse square law applies as well. The further away your subject is from the light source, the less light they're going to receive. So moving on then, away from that, now that we understand how our flashes work, let's have a look at how we can actually control flash exposure. We had a look at how we can control flash exposure using a manual flash. We are going to be revisiting that, but not until our studio photography lesson. So we'll put that aside for the moment and we'll have a look at how to control flash exposure using TTL systems. And as I mentioned, we still have a lot of control over flash exposure using TTL. So first of all, let's have a look at a subject with no flash. So here's a very simple photograph. Underexposed, we're photographing at f5.6, 125th of a second. We're photographing at an ISO of 200, and it's clearly too dark for this situation. We can see our subject is underexposed. So what do? We decide that we want to use a flash. So in this one, we've added a pop of light. We've used a flash here. We're photographing from the photographer's left, so we can see that we have shadow here. So it's an off-camera flash. It doesn't matter that it's off camera, it works the exact same way. We can see now that we have this kind of shape of light on the subject, but the subject is more or less correctly exposed. We've used the exact same settings as we did in the previous shot, but this time we've introduced the flash. The TTL system has done the work, and we have our subject correctly exposed. Now the background is still underexposed. That doesn't matter. That's neither correct nor incorrect. That's a decision that we make whether or not we want to have that background underexposed. So how can I change the exposure on the background? Can anybody tell me that? So I want you to let me know, how can you change the exposure on the background? So I mentioned it briefly earlier when we're controlling flash. Our aperture, our ISO, our distance to the subject, and the actual power output of the flash. These all determine the flash brightness. But there was one thing I said that's not determined, that the flash doesn't take into consideration. And that's correct, that is shutter speed. So shutter speed does play a role in flash exposure. It doesn't change the power output of the flash at all. In no way does it affect the flash power, but it affects the ambient light. It affects the background light, the natural light in a scene. And if you want to balance your flash exposure with the ambient light, the key to this is to understand how shutter speed works when using flash. So in the next scene, we have changed our shutter speed, and the difference is quite stark. So we've actually used the exact same settings, except we've changed our shutter speed. We now see that we're using 1/30th of a second instead of 125th of a second. So we've changed it by 2 stops. So we're now letting in 4 times as much light as the previous photograph. Everything else remains the same power output coming from the flash. You can see there is a little bit more ambient light falling on the subject as well. But the key to balancing ambient light and our natural light with flash is to change the shutter speed. Now you can make these decisions here, whether or not you want to have a dark background or whether you want to have a brighter background by changing the shutter speed. And of course, this goes the other way. If you want to have a very dark background, you can increase the shutter speed. You can make the shutter speed much faster to reduce the amount of light. Now, this has its own limitations, which we're going to have a look at. But you now have 2 considerations here. You can take a photograph using a flash, and you can choose to have a very dark background if you like, by using a faster shutter speed, or you can change the background light to have a brighter, to have a more balanced effect by changing that shutter speed to a slower one. And these are 2 creative decisions that you now have when using flash. Now, what about if our subject is getting over or underexposed by the flash itself? So as I mentioned, flash does also have a tendency, when using it in a TTL mode, to try to keep everything in this middle grey area that we've looked at so many times before. What about subjects that are very white or very dark? These are also going to come out grey using TTL and flash. So how can we control this? But we still do have some control over our flash in TTL, and that's by using what's called flash exposure compensation, or FEC. So very much same way that when we're photographing in our semi-auto modes, that we can control the exposure by changing exposure compensation, we have this option with flash as well. And as you can see, it's usually this symbol. It's a flash with our plus and minus. It might appear on the back of the menu as a flash with a plus and a minus too. So basically it's allowing us to purposely over or underexpose when the flash gets it incorrect. Now it can be controlled through cameras or through the flash itself or through the camera settings too. So you may find it as an option on the camera. You certainly will find it as an option on the camera. It usually appears with the little flash symbol beside it. But you can also control it on the flash unit itself. You can reduce the flash exposure or you can increase the flash exposure. And you can see here it's indicated at what the current level it is that it's at. In this case, we're overexposing that flash by 1/3 of a stop. So it is also possible to change it by 1/3 of stop increments. It will appear on your light meter. So your light meter will indicate this usually with this little symbol beside it. So you're going to see whether it's over or underexposed with that little symbol beside it, the flash exposure compensation symbol. So do get familiar with it. Have a look in your camera's manual to find where it's located on your own camera. But as I said, if you happen to be using an external flash unit like this as well, it's much easier to adjust simply by changing the up and down, or the plus and the minus even, on the unit itself. So what does it look like? So flash overexposure is going to look like this. So here we have our standard settings, the same settings we were using, but using flash exposure compensation, I can see that it's really dialed up too high. We're at 1 2/3 of a stop over, and that's giving us a very overexposed subject. Okay, so we can dial that back then by using flash exposure compensation, bringing it back into the 0 range. Looking at flash underexposure, so in this scene we have our ambient light adjusted using that 30th of a second, but we can see that the subject is a little bit underexposed with the flash. So in this case we're just 2/3 of a stop under with this, so we just make small adjustments to bring that up to get that exposure correct. So flash exposure compensation is how we can control the power output and the exposure of our flash and TTL, and really it's something that you're going to be using the majority of the time. When I photograph using flash, I have a particular way of doing it. I often bounce the flash most of the time, which we'll speak about in the next lesson, but I also just make my adjustments using that flash exposure compensation, and I find it to be the best way to work, the quickest way to work, especially when you're photographing in high pressure situations. The final thing then just to speak about before we wrap up this lesson is flash sync speed. So we've had a look at how shutter speed controls ambient light. So we can make the shutter speed slower to increase the ambient light in a scene. We can also make that darker as well by making the shutter speed faster, but we have a limit. And that limit is the flash sync speed. Basically, flash sync speed is the fastest shutter speed that our flash can fire at. If we go faster than it, it has some unwanted and surprising results. So sync speed is located on your camera. You'll often see it, now this is just an old manual dial, but it is going to be located in your camera's manual, or it'll be some indication as to what it is in the camera itself. Usually it's a number with a flash symbol beside it. It might be indicated, like in this particular example, in red. There will be some type of indication as to what it is. So when you go past this shutter speed, if you go faster than this, so if I was to photograph at 500 of a second using a flash, I'm going to get this result. Okay, so what has happened here? Well, basically the shutter is actually being captured in the photograph. The shutter hasn't had enough time to move out of the way of the frame before the exposure has been completed. The flash has actually captured it and frozen it, and I end up with this particular type of shot. I remember this happened to me the very first time I photographed a roll of film using flash, every single photograph came out like this. I had absolutely no idea why, but basically I had the flash, the shutter speed set too fast. So what is actually happening here? Well, let's have a quick look. So let's say we have our frame. This is our shutter. It's closed, okay? So we take our photograph, our exposure begins and the shutter moves down out of the way. We have our fully exposed photograph and the shutter begins to close again when the exposure is finishing until it is completely closed. When we use a flash, if we have the incorrect flash speed selected, what happens is that we have our shutter closed, our exposure begins, but the flash fires too early and it's capturing the shutter before it has had a chance to move out of the way. Our exposure continues on as normal, but the end result is that we get a photograph that has the shutter going across the bottom or the top of it or the side of it, whatever way the shutter happens to move in your camera, but you're going to see it in the shot. So for this reason, we cannot photograph faster than our flash sync speed in most cases. There is an exception to this, which we're going to have a look at in the next lesson, and that is called high-speed synchronization, which will allow us to photograph at much faster shutter speeds than our default flash sync speed. So speaking of the next lesson, let's have a quick look at what is coming up in that lesson. So we're going to kick things off by having a look at the different lighting direction, how moving the flash around completely changes the photograph and changes your subject. Has a huge impact on how our subject is represented, as we're going to see. We'll have a look at flash and motion. So we can get very creative with flash, and flash has a big impact on motion by freezing it or by blurring it or a combination of both. We can get some really stunning and creative types of photographs, and we have lots of new creative choices. There's so much that we can do with flash. We can introduce some modifiers, introduce gels to change the color of the flash. We can use strobe flash, HSS. There's so much more we're going to dig into the next lesson. But I do hope that you found this lesson enjoyable and that you've got a much better understanding of flash, because I'm going to give you a fairly tough challenge. I want you to take 2 photographs with flash, but I want you to take one with the ambient light very much present in the background by controlling the shutter speed, and I want you to take one with darker ambient light, so by using a faster shutter speed. So just like the examples we had a look at earlier, I want you to put this into practice yourself. And you can do this as well with a pop-up flash. You don't just have to have an external flash unit to do this. It's probably not going to be that possible by using a phone, but see if you can. Some phones will allow you to control shutter speed, so if they do, see if you can control it so that you get a photograph with the ambient light and the flash, and one without the ambient light and flash. And if you haven't got those options available to you at all, just simply take a photograph using a flash if possible. But if you want to give yourself a challenge, try and copy the examples that we had a look at earlier on in this lesson and post them onto our Facebook page, .com/Shaw Academy. So that's the end of this lesson. As I said, I do hope that you enjoyed it. I think a lot of students, a lot of photographers shy away from flash, but really it's such a great tool, a great option for you to be able to use. And as I said, really, if you want to get into photography professionally, it just gives you more options to offer your clients. And especially when it comes to weddings and commercial photography, it is essential to understand. So we're going to be talking about it a lot more in the next lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves and bye-bye.